Today we are looking at Confucianism and Taoism, and I know that I promised four, and I started preparing for four at the same time, and it was too much, even for, I was just like, there are too many. I mean, it depends on, I guess, what level you want to go down. But I've grouped them as Confucianism and Taoism because those are both Chinese-based religions. And I gotta think of all the and what was the other ones we're looking at? Dropping them off the top of my head. No, Sikhism and Jainism are both Iranian and sort of Indian based religions. And they actually do have a pretty strong just sort of presence, those two today, Sikhism and Jainism, more so, I mean, Taoism is still present, Confucianism is really at this point, not that there aren't those who practice, but it definitely is an earlier way of thinking or thought that has influenced many other religions in Asia, Eastern Asia. And I think that the challenge of, again, we went through Abrahamic religions, and then we looked at Hinduism and Buddhism. We had to kind of switch our brains to a different way of thinking, and then we sort of returned back to Zoroastrianism and Baha'i faith, and those both have similar categories or elements that allowed us to sort of jump back to the West. But now we're having to shift back to the East the next 2 weeks. Next week, like I said, will be more Indian, so we'll get into the more of that dharma, that reincarnation, that cycle, that influence, and those are variations of what you would call the Hindu system of thought or Hindu philosophy. Today, we're looking at Confucianism, which believes it dates back probably even back to like Zoroastrianism, and is in some sense of the endless cyclical nature of life, but not also believing in reincarnation. So you're finding sort of something in Confucianism, we find something in between, almost a little bit of that Western. There is a sense of life and death and afterlife in a way that, so if you were to basically combine some sense of Buddhist expression with maybe some of the categories of Western Abrahamic religions, I didn't know this. Confucianism has a doctrine of afterlife, and they don't believe in reincarnation. Taoism a little bit more leaves a little bit more room for that, but does still extend from the same. I'm going to try. I've prepared for these, and they've started to blur a little bit. So I may get some things in my mind as I just bear with me. I'm asking for a smidge of grace today in terms of if I might have to backtrack and reconnect, because I studied Confucianism and then today I studied Taoism, and those two things are, because they are overlap quite a bit. But I'll try to connect them where they are. Confucianism, let's start there because it's older and it's believed to go back thousands of years, although in an actual date-wise, Confucius goes back to about 550 to 479 BC. Which, just to put that in the Western mindset, again, it's before Christ, so this would have been around the time that Jerusalem would have been returning from Persia and reestablishing itself as a people. Cyrus the Great said, no, we don't need them in exile. Let's send everyone back. They go back, and it would have been during this period that they would have in part been in exile, but then returned, because they were in exile 70 years in Persia. So again, what's interesting, and I always find it just the correlation between connectivity of world religions or things that are happening around the same time. Not only that, but you remember the Israel, as they go back and they reestablish themselves. That also, once they get reestablished, leads into what we call the 400 years of silence. It leads into those intertestamental periods for us, between when the Old Testament sacred texts were written and the New Testament sacred texts were written. Again, the Apocrypha being written in that last 400 years before Christ. But What's interesting about that is just the sense of Confucianism developing during that period of silence. So so going back to those who were with us last week when we talked about the Baha'i faith and how that was a progression of world religions or God manifesting thought through manifestations in human beings. Confucianism, I don't think actually I didn't check that, I should, Confucianism was not one of those, did I write them all down? I don't even remember. As I think about that, Buddhism, no, it was not one of them. I didn't think it was. Although it does have a figure to attach it to, Confucianism was not one of those religions that Baha'i would have considered the Holy Nine. That would have been Buddhism. But it would have probably considered Confucianism as a basis for how Buddhism emerged or informed Buddhism. And this is where, when we think about the different views of Christianity and all the different takes on things, I mean, evangelical Christianity to, I would say middle church, sort of mainline church like us, we're liturgical, but we're not like high church liturgical like the Catholic or Orthodox Church. But we're all worshiping the same God, right? But in vastly different ways and with varying doctrines. So whenever you look at anything, again, one of these religions, you're always having a lot of influences that come into play. I know this is probably, is that better, Denny? I'm gonna scoot this way a little bit. Forward. There we go. Is that better? It's better for the, okay. Sorry about, for you online watchers. But the idea that thought developed and God revealed, and in thinking about the Baha'i faith last week and how that progression of thought and God revealing things in stages, it was interesting to think. I could understand why they would say, even looking at Judaism, which sort of had this pause in its revelation, its prophets, its writings, that at the same time, then God, almost in a modalistic way, came over here to the eastern side of the world and started stimulating things. Now, the reason why Baha'i would not consider Confucianism, although it does go back to a character of Confucius, a person, we call in English Confucius, that's not his Chinese name, but is that Confucius was not a prophet. So while revered, he was not considered a prophet that received divine revelations. He was, like I said, born 551 BC. He was considered the transmitter of cultural values. So, and that's like that word came up again and again, the transmitter. And so I'm going to give you a big worldview of Confucianism. They believe that there's a process of humanity finding harmony with the world, and I'll get into how that actually breaks down, but that these principles that he taught in this period of 500 to 480 were where he was unearthing, he was bringing up or drawing attention to the old. What was there was actually a term for it. He was reanimating the old to attain the new. So, I mean, we have the same principle. Interestingly enough, and this is what was happening with Ezra and Nehemiah as they reestablished Judaism during this period. It was taking what was old and bringing it back and reestablishing it and reinstilling it, and teaching about it and studying about it for the purposes of renewal. And this is, and although it didn't really work, I think, in Judaism because you went into that period, and I think that's obviously for preparation for Christ. But ultimately, he was a scholar, he was a researcher, but there are those who believe that even his thought date back to that he was reaching back as far as 2070 to, and interestingly enough, and this is where it got really mind-boggling for me, because not only is a Chinese characters transliterated, but so much of Chinese or Asian or Oriental history come in the relationship to dynasties of leaderships. and what happened. And so that you have the Han dynasty and this dynasty and that dynasty, and one leads to the other. And I'm sure that we have the similar sort of thing in Europe with different European leaders and reigns. But in each of those things, there are threads that run through all of them that is where they sort of draw the Confucius ideas or principles, those things that have sustained. So although he may only have been around in 551 or was born in 551, he was a transmitter of the knowledge that went back 2,000 years before Christ. Okay, does that make sense? So he is a point in time, and then what he's writing about is drawing people in. So what is Confucianism, or to most of the rest of the world who are not an English speaking, Ruism or Ru classicism is another way to describe it, and it really centers around the idea of natural forces. So when you think of the yin and the yang, and everyone's the circle like this with the little wave and then there's a dot in each, this is about the harmony and balance of life, in something that Confucianism heavily participates in and believes that there is a natural harmony or order of life that exists in nature, in the world, in the created world, in the existence of this supreme force or natural force, which they will call Tian, T-I-A, with a line over it, N, and this also will come into play in Taoism as well. This sense of the way or the being or the forces exist. And in fact, they do eventually associate it with a person, and let me see if I can find where I wrote it, because my notes are all over the place. At some point in their history, I don't remember when it was. Let me see. Oh yeah, here. From the 11th century before Christ to the 17th century. Oh no, this would be reversed from that. There was a intermingling, 17th to 11th. There was an intermingling of this idea of this natural force of being over all things, and not a person. This is like, you can't think about it as a personified, as a being, as a personal God. We say Yahweh, we say Jesus, we say Holy Spirit, even in Islam, Allah. There's a sense of there is a deity that we are interacting with. And in that Eastern mindset, there isn't. This is just, it is what it is, and there's not the attempt to ascribe a persona to it. But there was a personified God named Shangdi, and during that period, those two images slowly began to merge, to the extent that modern day Confucianists, I guess, or what do you want to call them, or Taoist even, will have a personification. They still will pray to the Lord of, although technically it's not personified. In other words, it's not really a person, and there's nothing in the philosophy or theology or this way of thinking that would say that the Tao in Taoism, or the Ru or the Tian, and these are all words for this sort of force or power or energy or light that exists. There is not a person attached to that, although modern day adherence to these expressions may communicate in the way as if there is. Does that make sense? They're taught, they'll still pray to the Lord of, but it's not necessarily in the Lord conception that we have. And that's the challenge of the English language and trying to understand Eastern or any sort of, is that you can't say Lord in the sense of our figure of a Lord that's too programmed in our mind, but just this ultimate being.
Jason,
Yeah.
where did the name come from?
Confucius?
No.
Oh.
The
Tian?
uh-huh.
Well, Tian originally means, and interestingly enough, heaven is another term for, Tian also refers to the heaven or the heavenly way. And again, because of these are all intermingling with different Eastern expressions, there's an interchange there, but Tian is an expression of heaven, but also that is the same expression of this universal natural order. And this is what I'm saying, is it gets confusing but they have a symbol for it, which is interesting, and I'll draw it for you. I'll make sure I do it right here. And I'll hold it up for you online too. I shouldn't have had a wide gap. This is the symbol for the great. The great. It's like a T and a line. You see that? I don't have a marker. This is, in other words, if you were to translate, this is a Chinese symbol and it means the great.
Or
The great, like the big, GR, like the great one. And then when you put, and then the symbol for one is this line here. So when you combine them, you get this, not the top line. Can you see that? Did you get this line and then it goes down like this? And this means the great one. But it's not personified as an individual or a person or a being like we would say Yahweh or Jesus.
But is it the force of nature?
It's the force of, it's everything that is.
Oh, okay.
And so it's this existence of, and they actually have three different ways of looking at that existence. I'll just jump ahead, I guess. One is a canopy heaven theory, and that is that the Tian, or this heaven or this force, covers everything. So I sort of imagined it as like a saran wrap that then was heated up and it just sucked down into all the crevices. It's just encompassing. The second view is that, and these are the actual terms, canopy / heaven, egg-like, and that is the idea that the earth and the cosmos are here, and there's this almost round bubble around all of us. And Tian, or the force, is that which exists around it. And the third, which I think most intersects with us and is Christian in our terms of understanding of Christianity, is the firmament. I'm not saying that right. Firmament. Firmament. There you go. Firmament theory, and that is that in the infinity of time and space is the existence of the Tian.
I'm sorry, say that again.
In the infinity of time and space is the existence or the being of Tian. It has no beginning, it has no end. The same way we would say God and who God is has no beginning and has no end and was always there, and this is the notion, and in Western philosophy, of the unmoved mover. It's a common term in Western philosophy. Actually in Eastern philosophy, because it comes from, not East in the sense of what we're studying here, but in the sense of, I think it was Aristotle, or maybe it was Plato. It was Aristotle. The unmoved mover is everything that happens is done. I'm pushing a pencil. Like, if I do this, this is spinning because I am moving it. God, the deity we call God or Yahweh, is the unmoved mover, always existing. So their concept for that is not a personified God, but just an encompassing, everywhere, natural force. Natural energy, true light, true being, true existence. You can tease that out in any way you want it. All that is the force that guides. And contrary to what we believe, and necessarily in our existing world, well, no, I guess it would be the same. They believe that there is order to the natural world, and within that order there is harmony. But that we exist in a place where there is chaos. What's that, Jim?
It sounds like the force in Star Wars.
And you know what? Absolutely, and sure, why not? Because you could say that, there's been all sorts of things written by theologians about what the force is. Actually, we just watched Empire Strikes Back the other day, and they talk about the force, and I'm like, this is so the Holy Spirit, And honestly, in my cosmology of a new heaven and a new earth, the same thing that will allow us to fly or move objects is the very same thing. It's an existence of an order. I talk about Christ calming the waves and the storms, and that is Christ's command of the elements of the earth and the beings that guide those elements. Like this is not really that far-fetched. It's just a different way of thinking about it. Now, again, we're always going to be different as Christians because Christ is the fullest expression of that ultimate being.
How does that compare then to the idea of natural law?
that the natural law is part of of that existence of the Ru or the Tian, or that it just is what it is. There's no deliberation of why it is. It just is, and there's harmony in it, and that there's still an order. There's still a balance, but the yin and the yang is not just about good, evil. I mean, in Confucianism, there actually is a tiered cosmology, and we'll talk about that. And again, that the whole concept of they're not denying the material world. If you have different views of how God intersects or the Tian intersects with the material world, it's resting on it. It's everywhere. Whatever that whatever it's an egg around it. That still is some understanding of something pre-existing than what is already here, and will then pre-exist after or
Did you
exist.
not believe it was created at one time, or has it always been?
Well, we're jumping around a little bit. That's okay, because it's the universe was created out of primarily chaos. Hold on a second.
I'm sorry, go ahead with your notes.
Okay, yeah, I'm going to come back to that when we compare but let me just give you a general few broader definitions according to it's a Chinese system of thought and behavior. Now, you can say that about almost any religion. This is a European, we follow a European expression of thought and behavior. We believe, things about the world, humanity, and we prescribe ways of behaving in it. This is not far-fetched from it. So but it is considered humanistic and not theistic in the sense of there isn't a divine being that is punishing or guiding or directing, or there's just this tiara, this element. So it's not personal. It's deistic in the sense of, and not even deistic in the sense of there's a deity, but it would be more pantheistic almost, where the God is in everything. It is considered heavily a tradition, and I want to emphasize that because this is why Confucius is who he is. He was a transmitter of tradition. He took traditions of old, reinterpreted, reinvigorated it, so that there would be a new expression of tradition. And this will play into their view of the sacred texts, because the sacred texts are a point in history where Confucius reorganized and reiterated these things so that their sacred texts are called the Lanyu. We call them the Annulects. But what I wrote down was communal meaning. Those students of Confucius who carry on it, they are attempting to capture a communal meaning of the extension of this tradition. And it's a living tradition. It's not like it was meant to die. It was meant to sort of live in each generation that passes, and very in the similar way that we do as Christianity, but we don't talk about it that way, because we believe that individual conversion is ultimately what is salvific for the individual, whereas incorporating oneself in the harmony of this natural order of this tradition that they exist in would be the goal for them. Does that make sense? So it is a tradition. It's considered, like Hinduism, a philosophy or a religion by different peoples. It's a way of governing and a way of life. Now, we could say all these same things about Christianity as well. Are we a philosophy? Yeah, there's Christian philosophy. The difference is we say theology because we orient everything through God. We believe in a way of governing the world. We believe in a way of life. These things aren't really, and all of these religions have some sense of this. This is how you live your life out. But the difference is, when you were in these regions, much like Christendom, you just were expected, it was a way of being, the way of thinking, like there was no other option. It was just a way of life. Is that? It's considered the cultivation of virtue in a morally organized world. Let me say that again. The cultivation of virtue in a morally organized world. Again, Confucianism believes that there is order and harmony in the world, and that it is our duty as human beings to cultivate virtues so that harmony is realized as a human condition, not as an individual expression. So interestingly enough, again, Buddhist-based Eastern religions, or they're very much concerned more with the cultivation of all of us than the elevation of the individual. Whereas in Western religions, it's about the individual. Now, we have reasons for that. Someday God will write his law in our hearts. Individually, each person will be responsible. We have that as a part of our understanding of salvation. We are each responsible for that. I would say the difference is that we've lost the notion of once you come to salvation, you are then brought into a community where these same sense of harmonious, virtuous values are meant to be realized as well, a way of life that we're entering into. But Western individualism has trumped that. We believe in that we are an island, or that even though we want relationships, there is a sense of independence and doing it yourself and Protestant work ethic that defines what we do, and has probably been more destructive to the true message of the gospel, being that entering into our lives as humanity. It is a system, and these are all sort of similar ways to say it, but they just help me sort of process. It's a system of virtuous norms, which is that which is right and fair, is how they would define a virtuous norm. A norm being something that is normalized through a culture. So, and maybe in a few decades ago, it was still considered normal to say thank you and please and use manners in that way. Those are virtuous norms that define the culture. And they would say that which is right and fair. So I would say the same thing is true. We have these norms too. We believe that, saying please is not necessary, but it is in some sense, because it shows it's about the relationship you have with one another. So a system of virtuous norms and proprieties of how to act in accord with the laws of heaven. And this is where both Taoism and Confucianism play into. There is a balance, again, of all things. There's the constant evolution. When we get into Taoism or Taoism, again, that relationship between fire, earth, metal, water, and wood is a relationship that is in balance. And not that there's not life and death in that, but that it goes into a cycle of connection. And our job is to emulate that in our own lives and our relationships, and how we deal with business and life and our own personal activities. There's meant to be a system of balance. Anything out of balance is a problem. Augustine's golden mean, I don't remember what the Muslims called it, but they had another one of those. In all of these religions, there is this notion of finding a balance. All things in moderation, Paul said. There's balance. And I think that because all of these religions, and they're all spiritual pursuits, hint towards this, it's probably something as a part of our human conditioning. I would say in a theological language, this was the image of God given to us. And that there, as much as there is balance in what we call the Godhead of the Trinity, there's also, we call the theological term in the Christianity is perichoresis, which means a rotating dance. But there's balance and mutuality and reciprocity and all these things that give a sense of harmony to how the Trinity operates. Although everything we've been looking at in church history over the last few weeks, all these schisms that were happening and heresies that were brought up, we're dealing with the imbalance of the Godhead, wanting to place Yahweh over the Son or the Spirit subjected to both. Yeah.
If an individual goes out of balance and stays there, how do they rectify that? How do they get back in balance?
Well, there are practices, and we'll talk about the practices in a second, but basically it's physical discipline, and that comes even more more in Taoism or Taoism, that physical discipline really played a lot. Confucianism was very cognitive. Was very. I'm going to be right up at the table here in a second. Confucianism is very much an intellectualism. I would put more emphasis in Confucianism on the mind and the spirit. In Taoism or Taoism is a way of reaching that same spirituality or connectivity, but through physical disciplines. Both of them involve meditations, heavily on meditations. But the idea, I mean, the idea is that legitimately that there's a spirit world still happening in where we're at. And we'll get to that as well in a second. The last thing I would say, just generally speaking, the relationship between humanity and heaven is probably the best way to understand the yin yang, not good evil. In terms of, in other words, it's everything that, and I'm just going to draw it just for those who, so we're on the same page. Make sure this symbol here, yeah, people do it, yin and yang, and we often say good and evil. But this understanding permeates everything. It's not just good and evil. This is heaven. Confucianism is about the harmony in this way of the thing that they call heaven, which again is a term for God, Tian, the relationship of Tian and humanity, and finding that balance is how there's harmony in the universe. And so the idea again is that the whole, everything of the, not just the, and they would say, not necessarily created, but emerged, therefore the emergence theory of creation, I guess, but you can't even talk about creation without using the word creation. But the existence of everything comes through the ordering of chaos and everything coming into balance more than it does a creator God picking and choosing and how things unfold. Yeah.
Chaos, not evil, or is it just nature?
Chaos would be considered that which is, I mean, there's an evil there, and I would say disorder, anything that is the opposite of harmony is considered. And again, we're using words like evil because it's a Western word that we use to characterize something, and they don't necessarily, chaos and harmony are opposite in the way good and evil are opposite, but not necessarily always parallels. Mm-hmm. And wanting to put, and that's a challenge of wanting, I mean, there's overlap in that, but to do a one-for-one comparison would be challenging. They have five, like all of these Eastern religions, they like to number their stuff. They have 3 levels of humanity, of existence. The Tian, which is the impersonal nature, and that's sort of, and again, how that plays itself out, but this sort of guiding heaven, God, being, natural force, energy. And then there's humanity in the middle, and then there are demons. And they do believe in a spirit world, and because there are 3 places in the afterlife that where did I put that? There are 3 things in the after, no, wait, hold on a second, I might be combining. No, I'm combining. We'll get to that in Taoism. I told you it happened. It's because there are 3 main values or belief systems in Confucianism, and that is the filial piety, which I didn't know what that meant. I was like, what does that mean? I know what piety means, but filial piety is about your relationship to your parents and your grandparents. And I thought this was so fascinating in terms of this is one of their main values. The good name that you bring to your parents is central to your identity. And that will often manifest itself in taking over the occupation that they had and doing it in the best way you possibly can, not to bring honor to yourself, but to honor your parents and your grandparents. And again, this is about that history of tradition or that living community and carrying these things on. So when you think of Asian culture, in particular Chinese culture, the idea of, everyone saw Karate Kid, right? Mm-hmm. You ever see the second one, Karate Kid 2, when they go to Japan, and it was the idea of this son was disgracing his parents. And that was so deep, and this is a part of Asian culture. You don't disgrace your parents. And honestly, it's in my Filipino culture as well. That would be the worst thing to do. If you bring shame upon your parents, Whereas in the Western world, we're like, your parents are your parents, and you make your own way, you do your own thing. And in the way that American Western kids or parents are often disappointed with maybe the way their kids are acting or behaving or demonstrating or expressing themselves or whatever it might be, that is a heavy, I mean, that would be a huge taboo in Confucianism, as it is in many Eastern cultures. You don't bring shame on your parents. And this is why, if you've seen the animated series Kung Fu Panda, yeah, you all know this? No, you haven't seen it? As actually, the amount of times this was coming, Confucianism, Confucianism is throughout the movie, and I don't even realize it until I'm reading about this. I was like, oh, that's why. When the duck, who is the father, has a noodle making business, and his son, the panda, who he adopted, and there's a whole backstory to that, decides he wants to take over the noodle business, the scene is like, oh, this duck father who adopted couldn't be more thrilled that his son was going to take over his business and carry on the good name of whatever the noodle place was called. And that is a representation of this phenomenon, this filial piety of honoring those who came before you, of honoring those. And this is honestly why, actually, in Asian cultures too, kids will live at home well into their 20s. Kids, there's no sense of 18-year-old independence on your own. That is a Western, largely Protestant concept that has shaped and defined our culture heavily.
Not anymore.
What do you mean?
I mean, they're not growing up.
No, but see, the fact that, no, and that actually, on those online, not anymore. No, it actually, what's happening in our present day culture with young people returning in their 20s exemplifies that, because there's no shame in that in an Asian culture. And in fact, leaving in your 20s until your parents is considered communal. Your parents are there to help you get through your education and buy a house and all those things, and not because of affluence. It doesn't make a difference on what social strata you're on. The connectivity between the parents and the children honor. Think about how many stories or movies have been centered around the idea of someone from Asia doing what their parents expected them to do, and they can't break free from that. And the fact that our children are moving back from us is a whole different phenomenon. And the fact that we feel negatively about that, like you're on your own. I just took Judah to the dentist the other day, and he had 2 fillings, and I said, I'm not paying for these. I paid for your braces to be put, I paid $6,000 to have you, so you have straight teeth, and you've paid for your dental care up to this point. At some point at 22, you're responsible for your own teeth, and if you can't brush them well and floss well, you need to pay for that. You need to suffer that consequence. Well, I don't know if that same concept would be present in this sort of system. Why? Because there's a sense of your children are never independent of you, because it's tradition. It's a living tradition that interweaves generation after generation. And again, that's not something we think about, because it's so contrary to how we view our own generational cycles. So,
What about getting married?
what about it? Oh, then that's just an extension of the family. It's combining the family, and it's the parents' job to continue to maintain that sense of their flourishing in the same way that generation will do it for the next generation. And that connectivity is considered. This is why when you go into an Asian laundromat in New York City, you're going to see 3 generations working it, because it's about the community as a whole sustaining life of the whole, not about your child going off and being independent of themselves.
In pre-industrial age, we had that same,
Yeah, I was gonna say, not.
More so, yes, we did it. We probably did then, but there still was that sense of independence, and it comes in part from the Hebrew. A man shall leave his mother and father. There's a sense of you got to get out and go, but that's a part of that Protestant work ethic that exists, probably, that really you're right, it's pre-industrial. That's a Western ideal that is not present in Eastern thinking. So yeah, Jim.
Who's more dominant, the male or the female in the ancestry?
What where did I write that down?
So the marriage, do they go to the Parents of the man? Or?
No, always no, definitely. Well, yeah, it would be through the mail. Because actually, one of the things I wrote down was, so the second thing is humaneness, and that's just being a humane person, treating, respect and all that goes into that. I'll come back to ritual in a second, but filial piety, humaneness, and ritual, or what is understood as being ritual, is reason or order, is how the three main values. But the fourth value coming in was a social morality or social harmony. You don't cause discord in society or in your home, but it's thought to have been established explicitly through patriarchy. And this is why there are the worship of ancestors, because they believe in a world where that there's a thin layer between the spirit world of ancestors that can roam and the material world that we live in, or the progenitors of the male line.
Wasn't it true too that when China imposed that idea of one child per family,
Yes.
that they manipulated that so it would be a male?
Yes, I mean, that's why there's such a central value on the role of the male over the female. It doesn't make a difference birth order. So my father and his Filipino family is not the oldest child, but he's the oldest male. So he's considered the patriarch of the family in the sense of the children. This is true elsewhere as well. This is why I just watched or maybe listened to a stand-up comedian. It was an Asian American woman, and she said something about being an Asian American comedian woman coming out of China. She said, "So I'm just happy to be here." And there was this delay of like, oh, and then you could hear the crowd sort of catching on, oh, because they remembered in China it was. I mean, there were some times where they gave birth to females, and they actually would kill them, because you can only have one child. That's an overpopulation issue, but if you're gonna have one, you want it to be a male. But again, patriarchy is global, but patriarchy explicitly rather than implicitly.
So, you said there were three?
Yes, filial piety, humaneness, to be humane, to be, kind, considerate, compassionate, and both of these, Tao and Confucianism, compassion comes up a lot. The third one was ritual or reason. When I say ritual, it does mean the rituals that they enact, but that is based in some sense of reason and harmony and balance. And what did I not? I loved this phrase. That they believe that the value of harmony is reached not by legal constraint, but by ritual observance. Let me say that again. That the goal, the aim, that the social harmony, this social morality comes about not by legal constraint. In other words, not by legalism, doing this out of duty because I have to do it, but by ritualistic observance, because in much way they believe that by participating in these reasonable rituals and disciplines, that harmony comes about. So take martial arts, for example. That martial arts are not about beating people up or even sparring. I mean, you go on the internet today, you see mixed martial arts, and it's about competition between one another. In all of their original forms, it was about balance and finding balance, and movements expressed things about nature and about the harmony of, I went down too far of a rabbit trail down that path. Just because I've always been interested in martial arts, and I thought, oh, this is probably why my mom didn't want me to take any of this when I was a kid, because that's what they got wind of. That movements that are meant to embrace the elements of the earth, it's a philosophy of the way of living, and it's expressed in a physical form that is meant to bring discipline to oneself and harmony and balance in nature.
It's in those martial arts, they have things like praying mantis.
Yeah.
They call it by various animals, and replicating some of that and then being centered.
And everything and not that there's everything in nature, according to Confucianism, has a balance and an imbalance. So it's finding that sense of balance, and that's where there's a sense of kind of like in Buddhism, that sense of if you sort of rise above till you're the enlightened one. This is a place where if you exist in a pattern of behavior that brings about balance in the universe, you're doing good. we would say the same thing. If you're not a jerk, you're kind, you show Christ's love, you're doing all, you bring goodness and light into the world, that's what we're called to be. You know, there's a similar concept. We're not meant to bring darkness into the world in anything that we do. We're meant to bring light and hope and harmony and balance and, yeah.
Is there a lower level or incidence of mental health issues amongst people that practice this?
That's a great question because of that sense of balance. I would imagine those who are true Confucianists would have a sense of, I mean, this is a school of thought that I think still exists today, but does more, it exists more probably in present day times as something that informs other expressions. Then perhaps to be honest, I didn't even look at what worldwide population. It's just, you know, are there Confucius today? Yes, but instead of thinking of Confucius as a prophet or a god, or that he was just sort of he was pointing to the way. He saw himself as a teacher and as a scholar. So
I was wondering, the Confucianists, their children respect their parents. Well, what if their parents do not deserve to be respected?
well, in that system, their parents would have lived lives worthy of that respect because they would have raised their children in the way of that sense of balance and harmony in the world. And if the parents were doing that, then that should result in the kids doing that.
Right.
If the parents weren't that way, then the chances are of the kids being, I mean, you know, and this is what a weird environment that would be in certain times of Chinese history, but to have a child who had some bad parents, they probably would pick up that same pattern of imbalance or discord and spread that. I mean, you know, and it's kind of one of those things that I'm reading this, I'm thinking, man, you think about the corruption that is in China today, how do these thoughts undergird that? But then at the same time, I'm also like, have I looked at the political system of our culture? I mean, organized white collar, you know, mobsters run this country, and under the guise that we are a Christian nation. So corruption on both sides exists. We just do it with a little more cash and a little more finesse, and with a lot less people. So maybe if we had the population of China, we might be in a similar situation. And who knows? You know, China owns half the world or half our country right now, or whatever the stat is. It's pretty scary. So, but it's be a long time, long beyond our time. So we're just leaving the world worse for our children. There are 5 cosmic entities or 5 categories of, well, actually, I'll come back to this because when I do the cosmology, I'll come to that. There are 5 constants that they expect you to participate in, and they are accompanied by 4 virtues. The first one is, I'm just going to go through these. You can interpret from them. It's not, I mean, I could go into them more deeply, but it probably wouldn't serve anything great. Benevolence and humaneness. Kindness, love. I mean, just don't be a jerk, you know, mean people, you know, don't be a mean person. Like there's a sense of just be engaged in a way that treats people with respect. Righteousness or justice, a sense of fairness, a sense of balance, a sense of things in accord, nothing having an advantage over the other unjustly. Propriety or rights. Again, that rights comes into the sort of nature of reason, how we exist in the world according to reason and logic, is sort of that third constant. Fourth is wisdom and knowledge. They ought to be pursued in all things. And the 5th is sincerity and faithfulness. That's about like the integrity of a person. Do what you do. Let your yes be yes and your no be no. Like live out your life in a way that is genuine and care. So sounds like a pretty good person, eh? Like heck, if we all lived like this, the world would be, you know, I've often said if everyone in the world who actually was a religious person lived, regardless of what the religion was, lived out the ideals of the religion in an everyday, all the time way, we would not live in a world of war. We would not live in a world of hate. And in those who are atheists, probably would be like, hey, something's going on here, and then we would be an atheist-free world. Just kidding. I don't know if that's true. The 4 virtues that they stress are, and again, they tie into this: loyalty, piety, continence, and righteousness. They,
Continents?
continence,
What's that?
consistency. The opposite of incontinence, inconsistency. If you're incontinent, you're righteousness. Again, you know, like and I haven't studied these stuff for a long time, but I'm thinking, you know, like this is all like,
Sounds good.
it's all good. Yeah, I was like, you know, maybe no, not really. And again, this is what differentiates us from the rest of the world. None of this stuff is bad, and we don't have to view it as bad, because our confession that Christ is the fullest expression of the divine is what defines us. That God ultimately reconciled the world through Christ. This is just, I mean, humans trying to figure out how to live in a better world. That's all good stuff.
Well, what do they do when they realize they can't do it? It's just like us, we like to live like that.
Yeah.
But sin gets in there and we don't do it.
And we still,
Don't they have that conscious?
yeah, they do, but and this thing is, I think, you know, I mean, China wouldn't be in the situation it was today if these things actually were practiced by everyone. Neither would the US be in the world that we're in today if we actually practice Christianity. We're all in the same, you know, stinky boat. We're all in the ark waiting for redemption. They have, very interestingly enough, 5 orders of social life that start with the family and believe, and this goes back to that familiar piety or filial piety, that when things are in order in your home, it produces then on the next, you know, a societal level. I mean, that's what we would, you know, this, and you could argue this has been the breakdown of the last 100 years. This is why Dobson came out with Focus on the Family. This is why right now the Lilly Foundation, and you know, a multi-billion-dollar philanthropist organization out of Indiana, is funding all of these multi-million-dollar grants within the Christian, Protestant, and Catholic too, church today to investigate faith values in the home. I mean, this is what, when I was studying my PhD, you know, I was funded to study youth and young adult spirituality. That's what I was named a Timothy Scholar explicitly to study that. And as I did, I realized this is like, the reason young adult stuff is broke is because we've done a horrible job with college ministry. Oh, well, college ministry is like, you know, they did a horrible job in youth ministry. Youth ministry is like, look what we inherited from the children's ministers. And the children's ministers are like, man, if people at home just did their job, we wouldn't have to be here. The whole system is broke. We don't have, you know, my generation, you know, I would say I am an anomaly in the system of, we've catechized our children in the faith, but I'm a Christian educator, and, you know, Shannon is a homeschooler. So we have controlled our children's faith catechesis through our, homeschooling, and but that's abnormal at best. But there's millions of dollars being poured into the idea of how do we do this, and they're focusing on the same thing. It starts with the family. That's the bedrock. So the family, and then they believe school. And that doesn't surprise you. Confucianism, intellectualism, this is the idea of there's a rational way, and through education, we see the rationality of that. We're trained in that rationality, and we can then operate in a more harmonious way. From that, it extends to the larger community. Home, school, family, you're getting a wider circle. Then state, then kingdom. Now, that's language that we used at one time. We don't use as much anymore, but you could say that operates on a family, and then school, if you want to throw that in there, but that's a debatable issue today in some ways. But education, community, state being state, and sure, country. Why not? We're a bunch of, there's a lot of Christian nationalism, although I would speak against that. In general, the idea is that if we lived out these things in that order, we would see a state and a country or a kingdom that was led in a more virtuous way. This was the vision of Constantine, by the way.
How does the Communist Party of China affect Confucianism?
It probably is an affront to it because there's an imbalance. The leaders then are, communism, you probably, so I remember studying communism during my PhD and being fascinated at how gospel-oriented Marx's earliest writings were actually almost Christian. It was like a secular interpretation of Christianity. So Marxism and communism at its core, socialism at its core, is really saying we want everyone to benefit. We want everyone to have their basic needs met. The problem with all of those systems of thought is anytime you put someone in a power position that they begin to abuse, it throws the ideology of the system out the window, and it picks and chooses which system. So yeah, so they basically have a tiered communism where everyone on this level gets the same level of care. Everyone on this, and again, if you think about the caste system in Indian countries, or Hinduism countries, you get that sense of there's an ordering of life. And when you go back again to the idea that reincarnation is the reward or punishment for how you lived your previous life, if that's part of your cosmology, you justify it. So from a communist system, there's a justification probably back in their heads that says, I'm in this position of power and I deserve these things from society because this is the balance of society. Whereas Confucianism would not accept that. Because but this goes back to the core of of the belief system, not how it's, capitalism theory is a great system, but in the last century, we've seen more billionaires. I mean, I'm sure you've seen the stats. Billionaires own like 90% of the world, or, like it's some crazy amount of world wealth. That shouldn't be the case. That's a problem. That's an imbalance. And we all are affected by it.
So what happened to China when communism came in?
Corruption
I
happened.
mean, with Confucianism.
Oh, I mean, what happened to Christianity when capitalism came? I mean, it's a corruption of the ideals of capitalism is not a Christian ideal. In fact, Christianity would speak out against capitalism explicitly.
But did it affect their religion and Confucianism?
I haven't studied that deeply into it, but I would say, yeah, in the same way capitalism affected Western Christianity. And now we have Joel Osteen saying, you should have all this wealth, but he can't, but he has people on his own staff that don't have basic health care. So, I mean, I think one of the biggest delusions we live in the Western world is somehow that we have Christianity right.
Well said. Well said.
I mean, we're heretics just as much as everyone else, which is why when we start from that position of humility, of saying we don't have this figured out, we're called as individuals to live this out in our lives on a daily basis, which is what's optimal about where we live here in Lake City. We live in the most remote county in the lower 48 states, which means we live in an isolated bubble. You could put a dome around this town that we live in and say, you know what? We do have the capacity to have our everyday interactions impact the town as a whole. Whereas if you go up to Gunnison, your everyday actions on the level that you're in there are not going to affect anything about that town. So we have the capacity to create and shape culture in this town, which is the beauty of living in a small town. But even here, politics. Let me let me just go through the last few things here about Confucianism, then I'll touch on Taoism, and then if we can carry on the conversation. Just to go through some of the categories that I listed before, God is an impersonal absolute principle. Practically in Confucianism, gods are worshipped through ceremonies, but they're not really worshipped. They're venerated or revered because they're meant to exemplify characteristics or expressions of this natural order in the world.
So you don't have your saints?
They're not, because saints are personified. Similar to that in the reverence or the veneration of them, but not in the personalization of them. They would align with us in the sense of the veneration of saints, because Catholics and Orthodox believe in the veneration of saints, that idea that the saint is a picture of an icon of a saint is a representation of the saint, and in that cosmology that saint is up in somewhere in the existence of all that is and has some sense of consciousness. They believe their ancestors do as well. And you will see that in the Taoist, there is a sense of a multi-level that you can, when you die in this world, that you actually go, that you can actually become part of the spirit world. And I'll come to that in one second. But it's important to know it's impersonal, it's absolute, and it's worshiped through other things. They believe humanity is fundamentally good, so no doctrine of original sin, and that sin or disorder or chaos is what perverts and is destructive to humanity, and it's our job. I mean, so fundamentally, we are teachable, we are improvable, we are perfectible through choices and decisions that we make.
Like humanism.
Yes, if we elevate above, we can reach this. We say we need a redeemer because we have a doctrine of sin that we need to overcome. And this is why I mentioned it either last week, I don't remember, this week, it's all sort of combining. But the idea of Arminianism is Arminianism is what Methodists generally believe, or Episcopalians, or Anglicans, or the Catholic Church for that matter, that we have free will and we can choose. And even to the extent of some sense of perfectionism in the Catholic Church, that Pope is considered as about as perfect as you can, theoretically as perfect as you can get. Methodism, Pentecostalism, they're all Arminian expressions of Christianity that believe that they have a doctrine of perfectionism. Theoretically, you can be perfect. Well, that goes back to that idea that if there's a part of our being that is perfect, or that can attain perfection from a Reformed perspective, we would say that's outside of God's redemption. Because then it doesn't, we claim that in the Reformed tradition, in the Presbyterian Church, we claim that all of us, with total depravity, the T of tulip, you're totally depraved. There's nothing about you that doesn't need redeemed. Because if there's part of us that is untouched by sin, that part of us doesn't need redeemed by God. Okay. I know this, I probably throw. Our job as humanity is to cultivate benevolence and humaneness, which is expressed primarily in compassion. So again, I've never seen the word humaneness in so many writings or I encountered that this week more than I have probably in my entire life. I'm like, I didn't even know that was a word, humaneness. You just can't throw ness on the end of something and get away with it. Creation, they believe the universe was created out of a primary chaos, meaning primary not as mostly, but that chaos existed in the beginning. They don't believe in a God created everything out of nothing, that chaos was existing there. A primary chaos of material energy. And it was organized through the balancing of the yin and the yang, or which they could express in myriads of ways, but a few that I wrote down were the invisible and the invisible, the receptive and the active, the unshaped, the shaped, the order, the disorder, and I could just go on and on and on for every opposite. And there's just, you find the balance between those, and that's where the sweet spot is.
But they don't say what caused the balance.
What caused the imbalance?
No, once it got balanced.
The ordering, that's the Tion, the heavenly way, the existence. And was that always there? Yes, in some sense that was always there. There's always a force that will overcome and that has ultimate control, and that is, they wouldn't assign, they would say good, probably on a very casual term, but philosophically on a higher level, I don't know if they would use the word necessarily good or evil. Again, that's a Western thing that we want to put on that.
They do talk about demons.
Yes, they do talk about demons, and they talk about spirit world, and they do believe, and that comes in. So finding the middle way is what they're going. The afterlife. They are not. I thought this was really interesting because this taps into Christianity as well, or a personal ought for Christianity. They believe you not ought to be concerned with what is afterlife.
Afterlife?
Yeah, what the afterlife should not be something that you're concerned with. And if you're consumed with the afterlife, you're out of balance. Because if you found balance in this life and you found the sense of harmony in this life, your concern should not be what happens after. Your concern should only be what happens in the present. Focus on this life. A right living should be enough. Now this is interesting because in the last century, and I always use Billy Graham as kind of the climax. Nothing wrong with Billy Graham. But Billy Graham sold the gospel through the benefits of what you get, namely the afterlife in heaven. Do you want to die and go to hell and burn? No, of course not. Who would choose that? Well, I have the opposite for you. Heaven, pearly gates, eternal bliss. You're among the chosen. Why wouldn't you choose that? If those are your two options, you're a moron to choose burning and brimstone over this. And in a day and age where we've just come out of a war, the 1940s, and we see the rebuilding of a heinous evil in Hitler, and we're rebuilding, and we have this boom of Christianity, and we have this boom, but we also have this boom of folks of evangelism where we're trying to draw people in, and so Billy Graham goes around preaching, gives them this great option, heaven or hell. Well, this dominated evangelicalism for decades, in particular over the last century. But around the last century, we also have this movement of what's called missiology. I've talked about it before, Christian missiology, that says it's not about what happens after or the benefits that come from salvation. It's about how we live our lives on this earth. And so if we as Christians are still living in a place of despair, and we do, or a place of greed, or a place of selfish, or a place of inharmonious in Confucian language, then we're not living out the Christian vision. I mean, this is in some sense my vision or my hope, or if I could idealize my life here in Lake City, is that we would live a life as a community of people, whether it be during the year or exemplified or in a larger capacity in the summer when we have more people there. If we were to live our lives and truly in this sort of sense of Christian community, it wouldn't make a difference what was after, because we'd be experiencing heaven on earth. We're ushering in the new kingdom and the new heaven and the new earth into our own realm as a whole and spreading Christ's love wherever we go. It's what we saw in the early church. They gave up all their possessions so that all may be benefited. They met together daily in prayer. You know, people here are like, oh, I don't want to go to church on Sunday. It's a beautiful day. I would rather go hiking because that's my spirituality. That's not what the scripture calls us to. That's individualistic. It's selfish. And it betrays the very nature of what Christ calls us to as a community. So if any of you go hiking on Sunday, I hope you take that with you personally. Hope you feel guilty and you... the last thing I want to say just is they don't believe in reincarnation or karma because of this view of the afterlife. They don't believe that you're going to be reincarnated. This is it. This is the life you get. And what happens after is not important. It's not nihilism. It's... But they would say that when you're 84, if you've lived your life in a way that you have found harmony and balance in the world and in yourself, you wouldn't be concerned because you have overcome that fear that comes from we would call our human condition of sin. But in their view of thinking, you're that wise person who's like, I'm okay. I've experienced the joys of this life and this is what I get. And what's that?
I feel that way too, but I'm still concerned about what's going to happen later.
Well, you should be, because I've seen, no, I'm kidding. Just kidding. I'm just kidding. No, I mean, because that's I was going to say, I stopped there because I saw the humor in it, but I was going to say you should be, because our Western mindsets gear us that way. I mean, even our pursuit of the elevation of ourself, of leaving a legacy of wanting our lives to carry on and our memory to carry on for Confucianism, is an overreach of our own self-importance. It's like, oh, I need to be here. I need to have some presence. I need to have, I mean.
It's the original sin.
Yes, it's pride. As opposed to sort of, and so there is, like I said, all of this stuff is about the spiritual being pursuing. It's just an understanding a different way, different orientation.
I feel like they kind of are going to live on in their children and their children's children.
Yeah, that will be the living tradition, and that's how you honor each. I mean, honestly, in a pure sense, as I would argue for Christianity as well, it's a beautiful system. I mean, we in Christianity have, completely. Like the whole notion of the parent-child relationship is so fragmented. I mean, so fragmented. I mean, we don't pass on traditions. I mean, in fact, the National Study of Youth and Religion, largest study of young adult and youth spirituality in the history of of the world, points to the fact, and they did this every 5 years, they looked at the same group of millennials and tried to figure out what was going on in them. Again and again, they have come down to saying that the family unit, the breakdown of the family is what transfers faith. You can have, even if you live in a Christian society, even if you go to a Christian school, even if you have a Christian church, all of that is only going to factor in so much. Ultimately, what boils down is what happens in that family unit. And they basically, the reason faith is transferred and passed down is because of what happens in the home. And the most recent study of that, again, and they're studying millennials, but there's truth in that is applicable to all generations, because we've seen it work in the past, but it comes down to how many casual theological conversations you have at home. Because originally it was like youth that have a larger theological vocabulary tend to have a longer lasting faith. Then it was the young people who have these casual conversations in their home with their parents tend to be the key figure for lasting faith. And the most recent study has actually, and it's causing some controversy, is they're centering much of the stability of a child's faith expression in the father. As they look at people who have sustainable faith over time, the father figure, and those who didn't have that stable spiritual father figure have fallen away or have had challenges more than. And when you think about where our society has, I think that's a challenge. What is, I mean, again, patriarchy is, I think patriarchy has lots and lots and lots of problems. But if you look at the Judeo-Christian Bible, it says your desires shall be for the man and he shall rule over you. It was given to us as a curse, but a functional curse from God. But I don't think that's the way it will be in new heaven and new earth. I don't think patriarchy will exist. I think mutuality and reciprocity will exist. But in the broken system that we have, it's a system that God has given us, that we confess as Judeo-Christian believers. So, okay, I think we're probably pushing time. Do you want me just to go over it? Let me just go over it lightly. We don't have to go too deep into it. I'll just gloss over it. Taoism is one of the 5 officially recognized. Come on in. We're just doing a class on world religions. Are you all hikers?
We are. We were just going to come see what this was all about. We'll come back tomorrow.
It's technically open from 9 to 6, but
9
you're
to
welcome.
6.
But yeah, we'll be open in the morning. Come by, have some free espresso or something. So yeah, and then there's a hiker box and all sorts of things. But so I'll see you tomorrow. It's one of the 5 officially recognized Chinese religions by the People's Republic of China. It's also called Taoism, and there's arguments of whether it should be Taoism or Taoism, and that literal Tao or Tao means the way or the path. Kind of interesting, consider Jesus said, I am the way, or I'm the path, or I'm the gate. Again, similarities in terms of how it connects. It is considered in many ways to be almost early Buddhism. It began, Taoism found its earliest expressions in the 4th century BC. So similar sort of time that Confucianism, 100 years or so later after Confucianism, but you can see, so it's the similar thoughts, similar regions of the world. It is considered a combination of the 5 schools of Chinese philosophy, Confucianism being one of them. It draws, and again, that sense of relationship, even as we saw in the Hinduism, how one thing is affecting the other, and it's just sort of a different expression. It does believe in reincarnation. There's that earlier Buddhist influence, although Confucianism doesn't. And for me, that was fascinating. I thought all Eastern religions just bought into reincarnation and karma. Not so much. And that is that Indian influence of the Dharmic religions, which we'll look at next week in Sikhism and I keep forgetting, and Jainism. But that sense of Taoism is a combination of that. It's it's considered a Chinese philosophy or a set of Chinese traditions that emphasize living in harmony with the Tao, or the way, or the path, or in Confucius terms, the Ru, or the the Tian, the sense of, all of this is pointing to the same thing. There's a natural order, finding that essence of order or way or path to life. And Taoism in particular is concerned with the way or the path being how you find that. And this is that sense of enlightenment that Buddhism taps into, but the Confucianism doesn't necessarily tap. If I could compare them to Eastern religions, I would say Taoism is like Aristotelianism, or it comes from Aristotle, and Buddhism or Taoism is like Platonism. And then an easy way to remember the difference is Plato said, if you know what is right, you'll do what is right. Aristotle says, if you do what is right, you'll know what is right. Oh, yin yang, not so. The practices, the main practices, and this is where it gets a little freaky. Rituals, very similar to Confucianism and to Buddhism. Meditation, the idea that we rid ourselves from things. But they have this whole thing in Taoism on alchemy. And alchemy, I was like, isn't that like witchcraft, or mixing up potions and things? And I was kind of curious. Well, no, that's exactly what it is. It's about it, and it deals with precious metals, and this is where it gets a little trippy. It's a certain alchemy, in terms of an Eastern Taoist understanding, is a search for a universal elixir that it comes from metal bases, and this goes back to a deeply embedded, philosophy of medicine, that longevity was the goal, both in this life and in the immortal life after. And in Taoism, there's a category for immortality, but longevity in this life meant that you have done well because your soul is at peace and rests in this body that is well taken care of and is self-disciplined. And so those who live, the notion of the elderly, those who lived old, were revered because they have, obviously done something right. Now we know, and I've always heard stories of my grandmother was a two pack a day smoker and is living to 102, and then you have someone else who's lived their lives as a vegetarian and dies at 70. Well, whether those factors really played into it, but they were determined or desired to figure out the elixir of life, this mystery, and they believe because of. We'll get to this in one second. Because of what they believe about the elements, the 5 elements of the world, believed that metal played a role. And so there's all sorts of stuff about how much metal one can precious metals, primarily gold, but other things too. The process of making an elixir that contained metal that was thought to actually all sorts of stuff about and this was the alchemy. The idea of taking something from the metal base in a pure form and translating that into, and they consumed these things with the goal of living. We'll get to, so internal alchemy comes out through visualization, the restrictions of dieting, so i.e. fasting, mental sexual exercises to control sexual urges, and self-control in general. The internal alchemy is not about the consumption of the metals themselves, but about a mental purification, or more spiritual purification or transformation than. Now, external alchemy deals with breathing, sexual practices, and this dips into the Kama Sutra in that sense of the balance, or the expression, the balance of, or the harmony of controlled sexual expression, physical exercises, yoga, and the ingestion of purified metals and complex compounds.
So they died when they're 22?
So I'll say my side tangent for this is, my father was an enigma to me, in the sense of he was trained, his medical school was in the Philippines. He has, he is trained in acupuncture, he was trained in Chinese medicines, but he came to the US and did his residency here as an anesthesiologist and bought into Western medicine. So and my mother's a naturopath, very interested in like natural ways of healing. And so she was always sort of dipping towards that. My father, on the other hand, was like, sometimes he'd be like, nope, take some, ibuprofen. Not pinch your, put pressure points to do. But we had a Thames unit in our house, which was a modern day version of, a Thames unit? It's a little pokey, it looks like this, just a little wand, it connects to something by a cord, and it basically gives you a little shock. And you're meant to hit the pressure points of your body, the acupuncture points, to stimulate things. Now I'll say this, and this is where you get into homeopathy. This is where you get into dabbles into the essential oils, into herbs, into Chinese spices, and not spices, Chinese remedies, Asian remedies. There is something there that I can't deny. I'm not saying some of it's not, cuckoo talk, but I think in the Western world, we've dismissed that because it's not scientific or qualifiable or quantifiable in the same way, and so we rely on conventional methods. But I do think that there are things, and this goes back to the Taoist understanding of the body, in that there's an internal balance, and I'll talk about that, even in our internal organs, there's a sense of relationship and balance that needs to be put into right order. And I don't think swallowing metals personally does that, but they have, so they rely heavily, the whole system relies heavily on something called Xu Ying, or the five senses, or the five elements, and it's how they explain all phenomena in the world, and they view it as these are cosmic agents of change. These are laws and things that are defined, and we may not understand them, but if it's kind of like healthy gut. We as Americans eat a lot of processed food, we have an unhealthy gut. If you can get your gut healthy, back into then it will actually do what it's meant to do. Your systems will last longer. Everything will be in balance. This is the philosophy of eating that we find in blue zones. Have you ever heard of blue zones? There are certain cultures in our world that are considered blue countries or blue zones, and they have a longevity. Japan is one of them. They have a longer living life. And when they look at some of their eating patterns, they eat very simply. They eat a lot of fermented food. Asians in general eat a lot of fermented food because the microbiotics that affect your flora in your stomach, and it's meant to give you. So, and the proof in the pudding is in the pudding. They have longevity in Japan much longer than we do because they don't, drink sodas and eat a bunch of crap all day. But there are five elements: wood, fire, earth, metal, and water. And without showing you a bunch of, if you type in the five elements of Taoism, you'll get all sorts of interesting stuff, because the relationships between these five things is just sort of baffling, because there's an order. Like there's a generating cycle that says wood is consumed by fire, and then it turns into ash and becomes earth, and then out of that earth becomes metal, and then metal it robs the earth or does something, a relationship with where metal is. There's no water, and so it stimulates water, and then water leads to the growth of wood, and it's just anyway, I'm not doing justice to it, because they tease these cycles out in a bunch of different ways. But then there's also a destructive way that says metal, and I don't remember the relationship to wood, was bad. Metal combined with wood deteriorates wood, and then wood deterioration leads to earth, and then the earth deterioration gives rise to moisture and water, and then water is, I don't remember the relationship, lack of water relates to fire, and then fire is what reduces metals. There are a dozen different formulations, maybe not that many, of the way these five elements interact. And there are several cycles that are defined about those interactions, and some are more in balance and some are out of balance. Again, a whole system of, I was like, I almost didn't even get into it because I started reading about it. I was like, this is crazy. It's too deep. It's too much. But just know that that's there. They have three pillars in Taoism: simplicity, patience, and compassion. And they're expressed also in the three treasures of the of humanity, which are found also in compassion, humility, and frugality. You could relate those to some sense to the three pillars of simplicity, patience, and compassion, but they're all sort of pointing to the same thing. The goal of immortality is there, and they believe, again, the discipline of the body, if you can do these. Oh, and part of the reason they believe that is they believe the soul is a vessel, or the body is a vessel for the soul in some sense, and the more we discipline our bodies, the more the soul is in union with this natural order or universe that we exist in. I think we're out of time. Okay, 2 minutes. Theology, just go to the categories we talk about each week. God, they believe the Tao or the way is the source of everything in the same way the Confucians believe the heaven is sort of the same as the God, deity. The Tao is the way they describe it. It's the ultimate principle underlying all reality. They would say Tao isn't God, nor is it a God, nor is it to be worshipped. So it's not something, and this is really the true for Buddhism. This is how Hinduism and Buddhism different. Hinduism worships gods as expressions of a creator God. Buddhism says there is no God, so we don't worship that which is not. It's about being harmony with everything in the world, natural and cosmic, all at the same time. So deities, they do believe that deities are in this world, but they are subject to the Tao as well. And deities would be human expressions of, they don't personify them as beings, they personify them as characteristics of the Tao. So compassion, because there's balance, and when we're compassionate, we find that sense of balance and harmony. They believe humans are filled with both spirits and evil monsters or demons, whatever language you want to put on it. People say, and the spirit that we have in us protects us from those things. And then when we die and the spirit leaves, the reason we are subject to death and decay is because the monsters or the evil forces take over and we are destroyed. Death is thus the spirit leaving and evil consuming us until we're earth again.
So there's no concept of a resurrection of the body?
No, because Taoists do have some notion of reincarnation. But here's the interesting thing. It's not pure everyone is reincarnated. Buddhism said you're always reincarnated until you're almost absorbed into the enlightened nature. Again, to use the image that was in Kung Fu Panda, if you haven't seen it, it's a great movie, whereas the turtle was like absorbed, the master turtle didn't die. The little sparkly things came down and he was sort of he sort of immaterialized or, sort of floated into the ether. Heaven is the same concept as Confucianism. It's just sort of the natural world being, the natural energy, except for the fact that Taoism believes there are 36 levels of heaven arranged, or 36 types of heaven arranged into 6 levels with different deities. So they have a little bit more of a tiered cosmology. And again, that's a nuance. And that death, when you're death and in your afterlife, you have the possibility of exploring another world, and that is for both those good and bad. So in other words, when our souls are released from the bodies that we're in, there are some souls that roam. Hence praying to ancestors, because they believe their ancestors roam. They believe, actually the phrase was that death is a release from a corpse, a body. And we think of corpse as a dead body, but Corpus Christi, the idea of that's the corpus, the body. We call a corpse a dead body, but and one of 3 things will happen after death. One is transformation, and this is where reincarnation plays. And this is really, and I didn't get too deep into it. This was the end. My mind was kind of hurting. But I read a story about someone being reincarnated as a sword. So there's a weird embodiment that doesn't have to be in a living thing, that then that sword would be used for so this is part of there is a reincarnation piece, but it's not robust, as everyone is reincarnated into something or another, and they're all living things. So the first option is transformation into something in the material world. And that could be reincarnated into another human being or an animal or something else as well, but it also could be again, because if you have the cosmology not the differentiating between us and, now I didn't go into the reading how a soul might still exist in that form, but maybe that's just the end of it, I'm not sure, and then maybe it's absorbed back into the ethos. Immortality or eternal life, and that would be that you roam, and then, or ascension into heaven, and that would be, I guess, absorption.
Did you say absorption?
Absorption, like the idea that you're absorbed into the heavens and you become part of the, and again, this is another way of thinking, and it's different to us, but in the same way they're looking at us and being like, why would you think there's one ultimate being that's controlling all of this, that's guiding this, that incarnated, and like they would look at Christianity and be like, that's the cuckooest cosmology I've heard. So we're all looking at each other saying, that doesn't make sense to me, but partly that's because of the way you think. Now, and in this way, this is probably why Baha'i faith is growing as a world religion. Because in a world where you have all these options and it gets confusing, and if you don't have this personal encounter, and I'm assuming most people here have had some impersonal encounter with Christ that calls us, with the Spirit that moves us, and that's what defines our Christianity and our connection to God. If that's not something that's moving and the Spirit is moving in you, doesn't mean that these people are still not dabbling in the spirit world or still not experiencing spiritual phenomenon. This is why we believe that there are demons in this world and that there are other things in this world that we can't see and that function and that exist. But we believe in a God that is over all those things and that gives us truly control over the world, because Christ is the ultimate revelation and exemption of who God is. And in his death, he retained control of the kingdom, but has yet to return for the final culmination. And in both of these, there is no final culmination, at least that has been revealed. And that's the two smaller Eastern religions. Yeah.
Did you run into anything about crystals? Why do New Age people get into crystals? Does it come back to them?